On a Thursday morning, a major announcement out of Washington sent a shockwave through global markets and the auto industry. The message was straightforward. According to the president, this tariff move is meant to revive domestic manufacturing, reduce dependence on foreign suppliers, and bring more jobs back to American soil. The announcement came with immediate consequences. The White House claimed the tariffs could generate over $100 billion annually for the U.S. economy. But many experts were quick to point out that collecting revenue from tariffs is not the same as creating value. Tariffs are essentially taxes, and those taxes are often passed directly on to consumers through higher prices. That's one of the reasons the news was met with concern, not just internationally but also within the U.S. President Trump, however, remained unmoved by concerns over rising vehicle costs. In a public statement, he said he couldn't care less if cars became more expensive, as long as it meant more production was happening inside the country. From his perspective, the short-term pain would be justified by long-term gain. It's a clear signal that the administration is prioritizing domestic manufacturing, even if it disrupts international trade relationships and raises prices for American consumers in the process. But while the intention may be to boost U.S. industry, the impact extends far beyond American borders. Some of the largest automotive exporters to the U.S. are close allies: Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and Germany. These countries make up a significant portion of the vehicles and components used in American car production and retail. For example, Germany exported over 400,000 vehicles to the U.S. last year alone, making the American market one of the most vital for German automakers. That flow of trade is now under serious threat. The European Union responded quickly. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen expressed deep regret over the decision, describing tariffs as harmful to both businesses and consumers. She reaffirmed the EU's commitment to finding diplomatic solutions but also made it clear that Europe would protect its own economic interests. The message was cautious but firm. In Japan, the mood was equally uneasy. Government officials described the move as a direct challenge to their economic partnership with the U.S. and urged the administration to reconsider. A representative from Japan's Ministry of Trade said that while multiple options were on the table, the country hoped to avoid a situation that would damage long-standing economic ties. The phrase, "all options in mind," was repeated, a diplomatic signal that retaliation, if it came, would be strategic, not emotional. These reactions weren't limited to national governments. Car manufacturers began speaking out as well. Mercedes-Benz, one of Germany's most iconic brands, warned that the tariffs could push them to reconsider which models they continue selling in the U.S. Their entry-level vehicles, which are more price-sensitive, could become too expensive to remain competitive after the tariff is applied. While some of their higher-margin models are built in Alabama, a significant portion of their lineup is still imported from Europe. The company stated it was monitoring the situation closely, a phrase that often precedes more definitive action. Meanwhile, U.S. senators in automotive-heavy states are facing pressure to protect local economies. In Alabama, home to massive assembly plants operated by Honda, Hyundai, Toyota, Mazda, and Mercedes-Benz, lawmakers are urging caution. Senator Tommy Tuberville publicly stated that while constituents were concerned, he hoped the president would soon clarify the full plan and address supply chain fears. These plants don't just build cars. They create thousands of jobs, both directly and indirectly, and rely on parts that are often sourced from abroad. Even small increases in part costs can ripple out into layoffs, reduced production, or even temporary plant closures. That's the real complication. American-made cars aren't entirely American. According to data from the U.S. Department of Transportation, up to 60% of the components in a vehicle assembled in the U.S. can be sourced from outside the country. That means the 25% tariff doesn't just affect foreign cars, it affects the entire supply chain, including American manufacturers like GM, Ford, and Stellantis. While these companies might not be paying tariffs on their final products, they will pay more for the parts that go into them. This has led to an ironic twist in the policy. Tariffs meant to help domestic automakers could end up hurting them just as much as their foreign competitors. Many American automakers operate plants in Mexico and Canada under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced NAFTA. Vehicles and parts that meet the content requirements of this trade deal might avoid the full brunt of the tariffs, but anything falling outside those limits will be hit. That includes plenty of parts and subcomponents that are not easily traceable under current supply chain systems. In the case of General Motors, nearly half of its vehicles sold in the U.S. are not made domestically, some are assembled in Canada or Mexico. Ford, on the other hand, builds a larger percentage of its fleet in the U.S., and companies like Tesla and Rivian are even more insulated. But even Tesla, which assembles its cars in California and Texas, uses battery minerals, electronics, and other parts from global suppliers. So while the rhetoric is about protecting American jobs, the practical effect may be an increase in consumer prices, disruptions to existing supply chains, and confusion among automakers trying to figure out how to comply. The rules aren't fully clear yet. Trade lawyers are digging through the legal language, trying to determine what counts as compliant and what doesn't. In some cases, automakers are already holding shipments at ports, waiting for clarification before risking major penalties. For consumers, the fallout is likely to be felt in showrooms first. Many analysts expect prices on certain models to go up within weeks. Dealers may adjust sticker prices, reduce discounts, or shift marketing strategies to steer buyers toward locally built models. At the same time, supply shortages could create further delays for certain trims or vehicle types that are primarily imported. At a national level, the move is also a challenge to the global trade system that has governed car production for decades. The automotive industry is one of the most interconnected sectors in the global economy. Parts for a single vehicle might cross borders multiple times before final assembly. The new tariff disrupts that model, adding unpredictability at a time when the industry is already navigating the shift to electric vehicles, digital transformation, and economic instability in major markets like China and Europe. European officials are considering a wide range of responses, some of which go beyond simply mirroring the U.S. tariffs. One of the most discussed tools is the EU's so-called anti-coercion instrument. It's a legal framework that allows the bloc to respond to economic pressure from other countries using targeted countermeasures. These don't have to be limited to the auto industry, they can extend into areas like digital services, intellectual property rights, and regulatory barriers, sectors where American firms, especially tech giants, have a strong presence in Europe. The irony isn't lost on observers. President Trump has repeatedly complained about Europe's treatment of American tech companies. He criticized digital services taxes in countries like France and Spain, arguing that they unfairly target companies like Google, Apple, and Meta. If the EU chooses to retaliate through regulation rather than tariffs, it could strike exactly where the US tech sector is most vulnerable. At the same time, industry responses are beginning to take shape. Mercedes-Benz, one of Germany's most prominent automakers, is reportedly reviewing its U.S. strategy. While the company already builds high-margin SUVs in Alabama, a significant portion of its entry-level vehicles are imported from Europe. Tariffs could make those models unprofitable to sell in the U.S. Mercedes has already suggested that it might pull some of its more affordable vehicles from the American market altogether if price increases push them beyond reach for average consumers. The situation is similar for other European automakers. BMW, Volkswagen, and Audi all maintain operations in the US, but they also rely heavily on imports. While BMW builds many of its SUVs in South Carolina, other models like the 3 Series sedan are still made in Germany. Volkswagen assembles several models in Mexico and Tennessee, but also imports vehicles from Europe and Asia. The more their vehicles depend on cross-border supply chains, the harder it becomes to shield them from tariff-related cost increases. Over in Asia, the reaction has been no less serious. Japan, which counts the U.S. as one of its largest automotive export destinations, expressed formal concern through its trade ministry. Officials stopped short of announcing direct countermeasures but said they were reviewing their options carefully. South Korea, which has already navigated tense trade moments with the U.S. in recent years, has also indicated that it is watching the situation closely. The underlying issue here is not just about car prices or manufacturing jobs, it's about the rules of global trade and whether they still apply. For decades, the world operated under the assumption that trade would continue to become more open, more integrated, and more stable. Countries built their supply chains around this model, creating networks of shared production that cross borders multiple times before a final product is ready. Tariffs disrupt that model. They insert cost and uncertainty into a system that relies on predictability. And unlike previous trade disputes, this one touches a product that is central to nearly every major economy. Cars aren't just consumer goods. They represent massive industries, countless jobs, and billions in revenue. An interruption here doesn't just affect automakers, it impacts steel, rubber, electronics, software, logistics, and more. The EU, for its part, appears determined to avoid what it calls a tariff spiral. Officials are walking a careful line, asserting their right to respond but also warning against unnecessary escalation. They've seen this before. During Trump's first term, tariffs on steel and aluminum led to retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods like whiskey, denim, and motorcycles. The standoff was eventually resolved through temporary agreements, but not before it caused months of disruption and diplomatic strain. Still, the scale of the current tariffs is much larger. Imposing a 25% duty on all imported cars and light trucks affects an enormous segment of the global economy. The automotive industry is one of the largest sectors in international trade, and the U.S. is one of its biggest markets. For some countries, losing access to the U.S. at competitive prices could force a complete restructuring of their export strategies. It's not just governments feeling the pressure. Industry groups across Europe and Asia are lobbying hard behind the scenes. Auto industry leaders in Germany, for instance, have warned that the tariffs could lead to job losses, factory shutdowns, and falling profits. Several manufacturers are already dealing with falling sales in China and sluggish growth in Europe. Losing ground in the U.S. would only add to their struggles. Meanwhile, global supply chains are being reevaluated in real time. Companies that once relied on a complex network of factories and suppliers scattered across multiple countries are now looking for ways to simplify. That might mean shifting production to the U.S. if possible, or pulling out of the American market altogether. Neither option is simple or cheap. At the same time, the political dimension of this decision can't be ignored. Trump has made economic nationalism a central part of his platform. The auto tariffs are not just a trade policy, they're a political message. They're designed to appeal to voters who feel left behind by globalization and who believe that bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. is worth higher prices or diplomatic friction. But that framing doesn't account for the full picture. Many of the vehicles built in the U.S. rely on imported parts. Many foreign automakers employ thousands of American workers. The distinction between foreign and domestic isn't as clear as it might seem. That's why even some American automakers are uneasy. Companies like General Motors and Ford rely on international suppliers. Their vehicles, while assembled in the U.S., are global products. If the cost of components rises, so do their production costs, regardless of where final assembly happens. The early data is beginning to show a clear divide between companies that are positioned to ride out the tariffs with minimal disruption and those that may be forced into serious restructuring or retreat from the U.S. market. According to analysts and recent estimates compiled by Yahoo Finance, the impact of the tariffs on automakers varies widely. Some brands may only see modest price increases per vehicle. Others are facing significant price hikes that could render some of their models uncompetitive. It all comes down to where a vehicle is made, how compliant it is with the USMCA trade agreement, and how dependent the manufacturer is on imported parts. Take Tesla, for example. The electric vehicle maker does nearly all its assembly in the United States, with major production facilities in California and Texas. Because of this, it's in a relatively strong position to absorb the shock of the new tariffs. Early calculations suggest that the cost impact per vehicle for Tesla might be around $1,600, mostly related to imported components like battery materials and electronics. While that's not insignificant, it's a far smaller figure compared to what some of its competitors are facing. Jaguar Land Rover, on the other hand, sits on the opposite end of the spectrum. Owned by Tata Motors, the company produces none of its vehicles in the United States. All Jaguar and Land Rover models sold in America are imported, meaning they will be hit with the full 25% tariff. There are already reports that the company is holding shipments at ports while it figures out how to proceed. For a brand that already struggles with U.S. market share and profitability, this could be a serious blow. Volvo, another brand in a tough position, does manufacture some vehicles in the United States, such as the electric EX90 at its South Carolina plant. But the vast majority of its lineup is still imported, leaving it highly exposed. Executives at Volvo have acknowledged the challenge and are considering shifting more production to their American facility. But retooling production lines and reshaping global supply chains doesn't happen overnight. In the meantime, the company will have to decide whether to absorb the added costs, pass them on to consumers, or cut back its U.S. offerings. Mercedes-Benz finds itself in a mixed position. While it builds high-margin SUVs like the GLE and GLS in Alabama, many of its sedans and entry-level models are imported from Europe. These more affordable models could be disproportionately affected, as buyers in that segment are more sensitive to price hikes. Interestingly, Mercedes has said it will not raise sticker prices on its 2025 models, at least for now, choosing instead to absorb the costs internally. How long that can continue depends on how deep the tariff impact cuts into their profit margins. Volkswagen is in a similarly complex spot. The company has a significant presence in North America, including assembly operations in Tennessee and Mexico. However, not all of its vehicles or components meet the stringent rules of origin requirements set out in the USMCA agreement. Vehicles or parts that fail to comply will still be subject to tariffs. This makes Volkswagen's situation particularly convoluted, as some of its models will avoid the full tariff while others may not. Analysts believe that, depending on how compliance is verified, Volkswagen could face a patchwork of different pricing impacts across its lineup. Luxury brands in general are at particular risk. BMW, Lexus, and Audi all import a substantial portion of their vehicles. BMW, for example, builds many of its SUVs in South Carolina, but its sedans and performance models are typically made in Germany. Despite this, BMW is faring slightly better than Mercedes in terms of local production, which may help shield it from the worst of the price hikes. Meanwhile, Lexus, Toyota's premium brand, builds many of its high-volume models like the RX and NX in Canada. If these vehicles meet USMCA compliance thresholds, they may avoid the full 25% penalty. However, other Lexus models made in Japan will not be as lucky. Toyota has publicly stated it will not raise prices for the time being and is looking into ways to support its supplier network, recognizing that smaller suppliers are particularly vulnerable to the added financial pressure of tariffs. Stellantis, the parent company of brands like Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge, has taken a similar stance. In an effort to maintain supplier stability, the company has announced support measures to help partners absorb the impact and keep production running smoothly. One of the key takeaways from all this is that the tariffs are not just impacting automakers, they're disrupting the entire automotive ecosystem. Suppliers, many of which are smaller firms, often rely on steady, predictable order volumes to maintain cash flow. When tariffs suddenly make imported components more expensive or delay shipments at ports, it can choke off that flow and lead to temporary shutdowns, layoffs, or even bankruptcies. Automakers are well aware of this and are scrambling to protect their supply chains, not just their bottom lines. Consumer-facing brands are also being forced to rethink how they position themselves. Companies with higher production percentages in the U.S., like Ford, Rivian, and Honda, are using this moment to highlight their Made in America credentials. Honda, despite being headquartered in Japan, actually produces a large majority of its U.S. sold vehicles domestically. In fact, Honda manufactures more vehicles in the U.S. than some American brands do. This gives it a major advantage, at least in the near term, as it can continue offering competitive prices without facing as much pressure to adjust sticker tags. The same goes for Ford, which has been vocal about its commitment to American manufacturing. However, Even Ford isn't immune. About half of the parts used in its vehicles still come from abroad. General Motors, despite its image as a cornerstone of Detroit's automotive industry, is also surprisingly vulnerable. Almost 48% of its U.S. sold vehicles are made outside the country. Some of those models could face the full brunt of the tariff, depending on how much of their components are sourced domestically. In the luxury segment, the tariff could disrupt what has recently been a close competition between Lexus and BMW. Lexus, which recently posted record sales in the U.S., is benefiting from its Canadian production plants. Meanwhile, BMW also reported strong sales with rising demand for their electric models like the i4. But both brands rely on imports for key models, and if pricing adjustments are needed to stay competitive, the balance between them could quickly shift. There's also the question of whether automakers will pass the full cost of tariffs on to consumers. In many cases, they may choose not to, at least initially. Some companies are using marketing strategies like employee pricing to soften the blow, but this often masks the fact that prior discounts or incentives have been removed. Others may delay official price hikes until the next model year or introduce fewer trims to limit overall costs. Either way, it's unlikely that consumers will be able to escape the consequences entirely. For decades, the auto industry has operated on a simple but powerful idea: build where it's efficient and sell where there's demand. That logic gave rise to a deeply interconnected network of factories, suppliers, and logistics hubs stretching across borders and continents. Cars sold in the United States might be assembled in Mexico, use parts from Germany and electronics from South Korea, and be designed in Japan. Consumers rarely saw this complexity, but it kept costs low and production flexible. Now, with tariffs in place, that system is under pressure. Automakers are reassessing their global footprints. Companies that once saw cross-border manufacturing as a strength are now questioning whether those strategies make sense in a more protectionist environment. Some are starting to shift production closer to key markets, while others are holding off on future investments until the rules become clearer. There are already signs that global automakers may slow down or redirect their plans for North America. Some European and Asian manufacturers are reconsidering their U.S. product lines, weighing whether to pull back entirely on models that can't be profitably sold under the new tariff structure. Others are exploring ways to increase local production. But those decisions require massive capital and long-term commitments. A factory isn't something that can be picked up and moved overnight. It can take years and billions of dollars to build new facilities or retool existing ones to handle different models. For example, Mercedes-Benz has invested heavily in its Alabama plant to build SUVs for the U.S. market. But expanding that capacity to include sedans or entry-level models would require a complete overhaul. The same goes for other automakers with partial North American operations. They may be shielded from the full impact of tariffs today, but staying competitive in the long run could demand even more localization. For some companies, the answer may lie in scaling back instead of expanding. If the economics of selling certain vehicles in the U.S. no longer make sense, those models could be dropped. Consumers might see fewer options in showrooms, especially in segments where price sensitivity is high. Luxury automakers could focus more on high-margin models that can absorb extra costs. Budget brands might have to rethink their entire U.S. strategy. At the same time, the broader shift towards electrification adds another layer of complexity. Electric vehicles rely on a wide range of raw materials and components, many of which come from countries that are also affected by the tariffs. Battery packs, for instance, are one of the most expensive and critical parts of an EV, and their supply chains span continents. If those supply chains are hit with tariffs, the cost of producing EVs in the U.S. could climb significantly. That would run counter to current efforts by federal and state governments to make electric vehicles more affordable and accessible. The uncertainty doesn't stop at vehicles and parts. One of the potential retaliation paths being discussed by the European Union involves digital services and intellectual property, areas where U.S. tech companies dominate. If the EU chooses to impose stricter regulations or taxes on American technology platforms in response to auto tariffs, the impact could spill over from the car industry into the tech sector. That would mark a new phase in global trade tensions, one that targets services and digital goods as well as physical products. This possibility is already causing concern among investors. Technology companies that rely on European markets for growth are watching closely. In the past, digital services taxes proposed by European countries sparked tensions with the US government. If those proposals return as a form of retaliation, the fallout could extend well beyond the auto industry. Meanwhile, global trust in the US as a stable trading partner is being tested. Allies like Canada, Germany, Japan, and South Korea have long relied on predictable trade relationships with the US to support their own manufacturing and export strategies. Sudden tariff increases without multilateral consultation or warning send a different message: that trade rules can be changed at any time for political reasons. That uncertainty makes it harder for businesses to plan, invest, or enter long-term partnerships. This may accelerate a global shift that's already underway. More countries are looking inward, building resilience in their own supply chains, and reducing reliance on any single foreign partner. For the US, this might seem like a win in the short term. But in the long run, it could mean fewer international firms choosing to invest in the American market. If foreign automakers view the US as unpredictable or too costly, they may focus on regions with more stable policies. The knock-on effects for consumers could be significant. Tariffs usually result in higher prices, fewer choices, and longer wait times. Even if some automakers choose to absorb the cost increases initially, they can't do so forever. Eventually, higher costs work their way through the system. That could slow down the adoption of new vehicle technologies, from electric drivetrains to autonomous features, as companies look for ways to cut costs elsewhere. Beyond the economics, this moment raises deeper questions about the direction of trade policy and global cooperation. Are we entering a new era where nations prioritize domestic production above all else? And if so, what happens to the global supply networks that have defined manufacturing for the last 30 years? The answer may lie somewhere in between. Few countries can completely insulate themselves from global trade. Even the US, with its vast industrial base, still relies on raw materials, specialized components, and foreign markets. But what we are seeing is a recalibration, an attempt to rebalance the risks and rewards of globalization. For businesses, this means building supply chains that are more flexible and less exposed to political shocks. For policymakers, it means rethinking trade agreements and economic alliances. And for consumers, it means preparing for a world where global product availability may become more limited and expensive. One of the more unpredictable elements of this entire situation is time. How long will the tariffs last? Will they survive changes in administration, or will they be rolled back as quickly as they were introduced? Much depends on political dynamics within the US and the willingness of other countries to engage in negotiations. There's also the possibility of further escalation if retaliatory measures trigger new rounds of tariffs. For now, automakers, trade officials, and economists are left navigating a landscape defined more by politics than policy. What began as a headline about protecting American jobs has evolved into a complex web of economic consequences and strategic shifts. But even amid all the uncertainty, one thing is clear: the 25% tariff on imported vehicles isn't just a short-term tax, it's a turning point. It's forcing companies, governments, and consumers to rethink the foundations of how things are made, moved, and sold. It's raising questions about the sustainability of the current economic model, and it's laying the groundwork for a very different kind of global market, one where national interest, not shared efficiency, may once again take center stage. As the dust continues to settle, this moment will be studied as a case of how fast the rules can change, and what happens when an entire industry has to catch up. It's no longer just about tariffs. It's about adaptation, resilience, and the choices that will define the next generation of global commerce.